What rights
them.
do white people have that blacks don't?
So the issue is, it's not necessarily written in the law.
Oh,
but
so
it
it's like
is.
hidden.
That's the whole point.
There are few things more triggering to a leftist than a White Lives Matter, American Lives Matter, basically any other lives matter than black t-shirt. Charlie Kirk wore one, and as you can imagine, got some blowback, but he set them straight. Check it out.
I noticed you're wearing an American Lives Matter shirt. What is your message to this audience right now by wearing that t-shirt? What is your intended message?
Well, I think that we should put Americans above foreigners.
You know that the whole point of, the movement, that came with Lives Matter was originally for Black Lives
Yes,
Matter?
I'm intentionally appropriating it. Yeah.
And are you trying to eliminate the movement Black Lives Matter? Are you trying to not bring attention to it?
I mean, well, BLM is not exactly a movement that I would be associated with, but I believe all lives matter. American lives matter. If you're a black American, Hispanic American, I don't care. All Americans' lives matter.
Would you take the time to recognize a group of people who have been marginalized historically and who are now asking for the same rights, the same privileges as white people in the society by
What rights do white people have that blacks don't?
So the issue is, it's not necessarily written in the law.
Oh,
but
so it's like hidden.
That's the whole point.
But the thing is, she said rights. She said rights, and then he immediately asks, what rights? And then she backpedals. It's always the same thing. People need to be careful with their language. They try to slip this by and say that we don't have the same rights. Then, of course, someone who knows better is going to call you out on that and say, well, what rights are you talking about? Well, see, here's the thing. It's not really rights per se. I just said that word because it sounds good.
That's how marginalizing works.
Oh, so it's kind of like, it's like a ghost. You see it one day and you don't. And
because you as a white privileged person with money have never
so
seen it, doesn't mean it doesn't
What privilege
exist.
do I as a white person have that a black person doesn't? What can a white person do in America that a black person cannot do? Be specific. Name one thing.
The answer is nothing.
So there are so many issues in our society.
Name one thing. No, I got to drill you in. Name one thing a white person can do that a black person cannot do.
So the issue is racism, okay? You can technically do it, but your life may be put at risk if you find yourself in certain areas where you might not be accepted by your race, and then your life might be in danger.
Yeah, that definitely would also happen to a white person who walks through certain neighborhoods too. That's not an argument for systemic oppression or one race having privilege over another. Racism exists on the individual level, and nobody denies that. They often conflate the two. Systemic racism, or quote, white privilege, is very different than individual racists doing individually racist things. Of course, there are horrible white people who don't like black people. There are horrible black people who don't like white people, and so on and so forth. But one thing I want to point out that they always do in these sorts of arguments is he asks for, just give me one example. Just give me one example, and the response is always,
oh, there's just so many of them.
Okay, great. Give me one. I can't, where do I begin? There's just so many. I don't know. See, here's the problem. It's racism. Okay, I'm still asking. Give me one example.
What is racism? Can you define to me what racism is?
Racism, well, I don't have the exact description as it is seen in like AP Style or like Wikipedia.
Can you just talk in the mic, please? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Racism is the lack of opportunities because of a race, the kind of like putting a person to a side.
So can you name a single example in the last 20 years where blacks were discriminated en masse, where they've been put aside? Can you give me a specific example?
You can simply talk about police brutality and mass incarceration.
What percentage of murders do black Americans commit in America?
So there you have a point of there is over-policing in black communities, specifically
murders.
lower income communities.
Blacks commit murders because of police? I'm not talking about murders of police.
You're twisting my words.
So why do blacks commit so many murders?
They don't.
So they're 13% of the population, and they do 55% of the murders in America.
So
why?
you're not even looking at the background of it. There is over-policing in lower-income communities.
There's under-policing in lower-income communities. Number two, you're trying to say that over-policing, even if that existed, which it doesn't, leads to the fact that 13% of the U.S. population accounts for 55% of the murders?
There is a target on people of color's backs, okay? So when a white person sees a person of color...
Prove it.
There is studies, there is research
No,
about
give me one
There
example. Give me one piece of evidence that there's a target on black people's back. In fact, I will submit to you there's the opposite. Black students can get into this college with lower test scores than white students. It's called affirmative action.
So now white people are the people who are struggling?
No.
Are they the marginalized ones?
I will go back to this, though. Can you name a specific example of what a black person cannot do that a white person can do? And be, again, specific. Anything.
I'm talking about so racism as a whole is not written in the law because that's not allowed anymore. But it still exists.
Then give me an example.
I just told you.
You said police brutality is your example. Why do you think blacks encounter police so much? They commit more crimes.
There is
and not just like a little bit more.
Policing.
No, there's under policing. And how could you say such a thing? We have defunded the police in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and largely defunded it. We saw crime rates go up.
I also want you to take in mind that when a whole group their opportunities to succeed economically, let's say they don't get that higher paying job because they chose a white person instead of a black person, that makes
Show me an example of where that happened recently.
Wait, that makes an entire community more prone to being lower income.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience in recruiting for over a decade that the only examples of that I've ever had occur after working with thousands of companies, hiring thousands of people, was the opposite of what this individual is saying. I've had hiring managers explicitly request to please send, quote, applicants of color. And of course, I had to tell them I can't do that. I can't hire based on skin color. This was, of course, quite a few years ago when this happened. I think nowadays that's very much more commonplace under the umbrella of DEI. The only time I had hiring managers bring up race, and I'm in the Southeast, I'm in the rural southeastern United States. A lot of the companies I worked with were like country people. And the only time that ever happened was asking for black applicants. In fact, the craziest I had was a hiring manager called me up and said, hey, the candidates you've sent over look great, but just judging by their names, do you happen to have any black females? I was asked that explicitly by a hiring manager. So as someone who was very close to the hiring processes for tons of companies, I can tell you that, and maybe it's different because I was in tech and the sciences, but my experience has been exclusively anytime race-based hiring, quote unquote, is involved or race played a factor in whether candidates were selected, it was they didn't want white candidates and they wanted black, Hispanic, etc. candidates, quote, of color. That's the only time I ever saw that. But that's just anecdotal experience. That's my own experience in being in recruiting for about a decade. You know, maybe it's different elsewhere. I won't make a sweeping generalization, but I have never encountered that.
And then that is lower income communities are directly related to like more crime activity.
But let me ask you a question. What percentage of young blacks have both a mom and a dad raising them?
Very low percentage today.
I cannot think of a percentage right now to give you.
25%. So only 1 out of 4 blacks in America have a mom and a dad around. Do you think that is a bigger issue to address than racism? Do you think more
100%.
dads is a better solution, or tackling racism, which you say you can't even see in our laws?
How could dads be connected directly? Like
dads are very connected.
Dads? And what about, okay.
When you have a dad around, you're less likely to be violent as a male, less likely to go to prison.
So explain to me why all the fathers are leaving.
Exactly. Why are they leaving?
Question for you.
Because
why are
black
they leaving?
women married the government and divorced the men that they were once
talk
with.
About
It's very clear that this individual hasn't done any extensive research on this topic, which is generally the case with most of these people that, like a Charlie Kirk, would encounter on college campuses. It's your classic leftist college student. This person, to say,
How could dads possibly matter?
is absurd. It's one of the most clearly defined factors that affect whether or not a child grows up to be successful in life. Barack Obama even said this when he was in office. Fathers in the home matter. They matter in a huge way. And what Charlie's referring to there when he talks about black mothers being incentivized to marry the government, what he's referring to is Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society that he signed around the time that he signed the Civil Rights Act, which he signed begrudgingly. That one move in our history is what created the modern welfare state. The system is very clearly laid out such that if you have a father in the house, you don't get the government benefits. So it's an incentive to break down the nuclear family structure. It's as clear as can be. Since that has been enacted, we've seen fatherlessness in black homes continue to climb. So that's what he's referring to there. The entire time he would bring up a counter argument to one of her, quote, points, she would immediately shift and bring up something else or generalize. So, for example, when he brings up, well, actually, there's affirmative action. And for example, at this school, it's easier to get in with lower scores if you're black. She just says, oh, so you're saying now white people are oppressed. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you're saying that black people are at a disadvantage when it comes to these things that I'm providing empirical evidence to the contrary. Every single argument this person is making, Charlie just calmly breaks down, and then she has no rebuttal, of course, and moves to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. I just thought this was a good example of the classic college-aged leftist. And look, I would have been probably, I don't know, we're in much crazier times today than back when I was in school. I was an undergrad in like the year 2005 through 2009. Times were a little less crazy back then, but I probably would have been much like this person, just screaming these baseless claims full of emotion because, and I've said this before, I do think a lot of these people come from a good place. They just have not done any deep research or critical thinking, or in fact, thinking of their own. I think that your average young person cares about helping people, helping the disenfranchised, making the world better. But what they don't realize is that their proposed solutions, or in fact, their perception of what's actually happening, is completely skewed. So this person truly believes that we live in this awful world where black people are oppressed still by white people. There are all these privileges that white people have. And look, I think a lot of it is informed by this person's life experience. If I had to guess, she probably comes from a pretty well-to-do middle class, upper middle class background. And her perception of what it means to be a white person in America is the life that she grew up living, a very nice life. Well, many of us did not, as white people, grow up having that wonderful scenario, that middle class, upper middle class upbringing that oftentimes these people assume all white people have. You hear the generational wealth argument all the time, that white people have generational wealth. Look, I don't know, maybe I got skipped over for that one, but I certainly don't. Yeah, there are a lot of people who are white, who have generational wealth, who grew up in great households. It's a majority white country. There are a lot of white people here. But something else you have to realize is that there are a lot of white people who did not and have all the same disadvantages that any poor person in America has. It's a class issue more than anything else. This person is clearly delusional and misinformed, but I try to be nice when it comes to this because my hope is that in these scenarios, when Charlie gives a straight up fact, look, black people, 13% of the population, 55% of the murders. What do you say to that? And she gives this really weak response of there's over policing, which of course has nothing to do with disproportionately committing more murders. And by the way, men commit way more murders than women, regardless of race. So really, that's more like not 13%. If you exclude black women, it's like 6.5% of the US population commits 55% of the murders. Or let's be generous and say 50%. If you say some black women commit murders, but it's mostly men. It's mostly young black men in that statistic committing the bulk of the murders. And the same goes with white people. It's mostly young white men who commit the murders that white people are committing. That's just a fact. That's a demographic fact. Men commit far more murder. And that has to do with many things. Gang violence, getting involved in crime, trying to prove yourself as a young man in an area where that's sort of a status symbol, right? There's all kinds of things that drive young men to commit crimes, regardless of race. But when he hits her with a stat like that, she has no good response. And she defaults to some talking point she has, which of course is a talking point that doesn't line up with the actual argument being had. She just blurts out over policing because she makes some association in her head. We're talking about crime. We're talking about black people, over policing, which if they were over policed, they wouldn't be committing 55% of the murders. They would be committing less. I just encourage people, and my hope is that, like myself, at some point, I was exposed to something like this, and my eyes were open to, oh, wow, maybe it's not what I think it is. Maybe the world isn't exactly how I've been told it is by these academic institutions. My hope is that this video does that for someone, or at least someone in that crowd realized it. The answer to a lot of these problems is the same across the board. It's success for everyone, which is driven by things like having a 2-parent household, taking personal responsibility, working hard, not committing crimes, graduating high school, not getting knocked up as a teenager. All of these things directly impact your ability to be successful as an individual in this country, regardless of race. Let me know what you guys think. And as always, I appreciate you. Please subscribe to the channel and I'll keep putting out content. Bye.